Curse Game. The scars on Lily's left side would haunt her forever. Lily had always been an adventurous soul, and her friends Emma and Claire were drawn to mysteries and the unknown. So when they stumbled upon an old, strange board game on eBay, rumored to be cursed and capable of summoning spirits, they couldn't resist. They decided to play it at Lily's house. Lily, Emma, and Claire gathered in the living room. The game, an old board with strange symbols carved into its surface and a small glowing crystal in the center, seemed harmless. Claire, ever the skeptic, laughed as she read the ominous instructions aloud, daring the group to proceed. They all mocked the superstition, thinking it was just a game. Claire even cheerfully touched the crystal and recited the incantation. Lily giggled nervously.
This is ridiculous. I can't believe we're doing this.
Her fingers grazing the crystal. Emma pulled out her phone and started recording, eager to capture the fun.
All right, let's get this over with,
Emma said, reading the instructions aloud. She muttered the words with mock seriousness, placing her fingers on the crystal. Lily and Claire followed suit, though a growing unease crept over them. The words sounded strange, almost as if they weren't meant for human tongues. The atmosphere grew heavier as the ritual completed. At first, nothing happened. The lights flickered as they laughed at the absurdity of it all. But then, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Lily fumbled to turn on her phone flashlight. As its beam illuminated the room, they tried to laugh it off, but the atmosphere had changed. Heavier, almost suffocating. As they gathered their things to leave, the three of them headed to the kitchen. The cabinet doors flung open with a loud bang, pots and pans crashing to the floor, echoing through the otherwise silent house. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. They slowly turned around. Standing at the doorway to the dark hallway was Sophie, their childhood friend. But Sophie had died 3 years ago in a car accident.
Is it really you?
Lily's voice trembled as she cautiously stepped forward. Sophie didn't reply. She just stood there, staring at them with lifeless eyes. As they stood frozen, the temperature plummeted further. Their breath turned to mist, and Sophie began moving toward them, her movements unnaturally slow, as if she were floating. Lily backed away, fear overwhelming her. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that made Sophie's form appear even more distorted. The growling sound grew louder, closer.
Get out now.
Claire screamed.
We have to leave.
Panic overtook them as they turned and ran toward the back door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. They turned to see Sophie, now standing in the middle of the living room, smiling. Suddenly, Claire screamed, clutching her arm where deep, bloody scratches had appeared. Her scream pierced the tense silence. Lily grabbed Claire's arm, trying to pull her away from the invisible claws seemingly attacking her. A shrill laughter filled the air, growing more frenzied with each passing second. Darkness enveloped Sophie, and they rushed to the basement, hoping to escape. There was a window there they could climb through. They raced down the stairs as Sophie's ghost followed. The basement door was stuck, but with combined effort, they managed to force it open. Lily fumbled with the window latch, her hands trembling as she tried to pry it open. Then, a force grabbed Lily, slamming her into the wall painfully. She felt a sharp, stabbing sensation in her side. Claire and Emma screamed, trying to pull Lily away from the invisible grip. Lily stumbled to her feet and opened the window. Claire went first, squeezing through the narrow gap. Emma followed, but as she began crawling out, Lily felt something cold and sticky touch her leg. With one final tug, Lily was pulled back inside along with her friends. Lily looked up to see Sophie standing there, her eyes blazing like fire. Perhaps she wanted something from them. Lily thought of the crystal. It was part of the game. They needed to get rid of it. She remembered seeing the crystal on the floor earlier. If it was the key to this nightmare, they had to destroy it. Lily ran back into the house, ignoring her friend's cries. Inside, the living room was in disarray, furniture overturned. Then she spotted the crystal, its dark surface reflecting the chaos around her. Determined, Lily grabbed it, a sharp pain shooting up her arm. Sophie reappeared, her face contorted with inexplicable anger. Lily threw the crystal with all her strength. It soared through the air and crashed onto the pavement outside, shattering into 1,000 pieces. As it shattered, the growling ceased. Sophie's image flickered and then vanished, leaving only an eerie silence. They stood there, gasping for breath, realizing it was finally over. As dawn broke, everything had finally ended. Lily and her friends huddled outside, their faces pale, etched with the terror they had just endured. The truck driver's nightmare chase. I'm Alan, and I want to tell you about my job. The only job I've ever had, and definitely one of the most dangerous. I'm a truck driver, often driving for hours, almost always sleep-deprived and in a rush, and worse, in the dark. Aside from the fear of crashing or falling asleep at the wheel, people always ask me if I have any stories to tell. That night, I was driving with my companion, Randy. Randy had recently gone through a divorce and didn't have kids, so he didn't have much going on. He'd had a few drinks that day and was a bit tipsy. As I looked out the window, I saw a lot of police cars speeding past me. They seemed in a hurry, as if searching for someone. I didn't think much of it and kept driving. After a while, I decided to stop so Randy could use the bathroom and we could take a break. I waited, but after a few minutes, my unease grew as Randy didn't return. Worried, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods. Hey buddy, you out there? Randy didn't answer. I didn't think he could be drunk enough to pass out, so I kept following the trail into the woods. I moved through the bushes, calling Randy's name. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a strange tapping sound coming from behind a large tree. Cautiously, I moved closer, thinking Randy might be playing a prank. I approached and saw a girl leaning against a tree, covered in blood and trembling in fear. I rushed to help her, but then I saw a knife in her hand and stepped back. Hey, what happened to you? Are you hurt? Do you need help? The girl stood up without answering. Instead, she began moving toward me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't identify. I raised my hands, trying to stay calm, but she didn't stop. I noticed her legs were covered in blood, but there was something off about her posture. Amidst the chaos, I heard a noise and turned around. What shocked me more was my friend Randy. He was in danger. Randy was sitting under a tree not far away, pale and injured, with blood streaming from his side. He was alive but weak. I'll save you, I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my panic. But before I could act, she lunged at Randy with a ravenous look in her eyes. Without thinking, I screamed to draw her attention, luring her away from Randy. She turned to look at me, grinning eerily.
It's hunting time.
I sprinted through the trees, dodging sharp branches like claws. She chased close behind, her pounding footsteps echoing in my ears, making my heart feel like it would burst. While running, I tripped over a rock, tumbling to the ground. She lunged at me, and I had to wrestle with her, holding back her wild fury for a moment. She seemed intent on devouring me. My breath caught as her hand slipped, stabbing the knife into the ground just inches from where it could have ended me. I shoved her off me, grabbed a large branch and swung it hard, striking her. Her pained scream echoed through the forest as the knife fell from her hand. Pain blurred my vision, but I knew I couldn't stop. Even injured, she continued chasing me, her breath ragged like a wild beast. Using all my knowledge of the forest, I took a gamble. I changed direction, heading toward where I suspected there was a bear trap. She was still close behind me. Nearing the trap, I slowed down deliberately before suddenly leaping aside. She charged forward, unaware of the trap. Snap! The steel jaws slammed shut with a deafening clang. The woman screamed in agony as her leg was caught in the trap. Without hesitation, I ran back to Randy. He was visibly weaker, but still alive. I quickly used a handkerchief to stop the bleeding from his wound. I helped him into the truck. Every step felt like a battle, but I didn't stop. Finally, I got him into the vehicle and drove away as fast as I could. On the way, I came across a patrolling police car. They quickly arrived and arrested the woman. They said she was an outcast living in the forest, hunting and attacking anyone who wandered into the area. Even her clothing had belonged to previous victims. In her hideout, the police found evidence that she had resorted to cannibalism and many other horrifying items. Randy survived, but the wounds, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. I couldn't forget that night either, but I told myself that I had done everything to save my friend. And when facing darkness, you must fight to survive. The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
Hey, got a lighter?
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied.
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap.
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked, without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
Where do you think you're going, girl?
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
She's stealing from me. Stop her.
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. The Cursed Game. The Willis family's house, her neighbors, stood quietly at the end of a dimly lit street. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Lily, who had done many jobs before, was starting her first day babysitting this time. The cozy living room was scattered with toys. Lily was greeted by Angie, a curious little girl. After listening to the parents' instructions and seeing them leave, the house was left to the two of them. Growing silent, Angie leaned forward, her eyes lighting up mischievously.
Let's play a game. Call Mary.
Lily froze, letting out a nervous giggle. Angie tugged on Lily's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading.
Please, Lily. Just this once? I won't ask for anything else.
Lily hesitated, but Angie's persistence made her relent. Angie explained to Lily that they had to go into the bathroom, turn off all the lights, and say her name 3 times in front of the mirror. If they did, Mary would appear. They must not let the candle go out. Lily didn't really believe it and thought it was just a made-up game. The bathroom was dimly lit by flickering candles. Lily stood in front of the mirror. She took a deep breath and said,
All right, just this once.
and they'd go to bed. She called the woman's name. Before she could finish, Angie gasped and backed away, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Lily reassured her, saying it was fine, just a game, and it would end now. Then they'd go back to the room, just as they were about to leave. But then the candles suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. An icy chill swept over them. Lily led Angie out of the bathroom, but the house lights flickered erratically. From the bathroom, a soft whisper echoed throughout the house. Lily froze. Angie began to tear up and asked her,
What's that sound?
Before Lily could react, a figure, a woman, emerged from the bathroom, her hollow black eyes and mouth oozing a horrifying black sludge. Clutching Angie's hand, she began to step back. Together, they ran and hid in the dining room. Lily tried to turn on the lights, but they didn't work. It was as if they were trapped in another world. Lily pulled Angie under the dining table to hide from the ghost's pursuit. Through the gap beneath the tablecloth, Angie saw her bare feet shuffling closer. The floor creaked with each step. Lily ran to the bathroom. She quickly grabbed the matchbox from her pocket and lit the candles. Her hands trembled as she tried, but the flame refused to catch. It was too late. Behind Lily, she appeared, her distorted smile widening as she raised a pair of scissors. Lily panicked, dropping the matchbox and crawling backward, sobbing as she begged for mercy in vain. When Lily locked eyes with her, she felt pain engulf her entire body. She could do nothing but stare, the feeling worse than death. As the scissors slowly moved toward Lily's body, ready to tear through her skin and claim her life, Lily thought it was over. Then she heard the cry of a child. Suddenly, the lights came back on. Angie stood holding a candle and screamed.
Leave her alone.
Seeing this, Lily chanted her name 3 times to end the game. The candle suddenly flared to life. A piercing scream shook the house as she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Angie clung tightly to her.
She's gone, right?
Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark bathroom door. The Willis parents returned to find Angie asleep, with every light in the house on. Lily managed a tired smile. That day was Lily's first and last day as a babysitter. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing compared to what happened that night. Even if you don't believe, don't take the risk. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still, and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety. I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." The two of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder, the creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up. Gasping for air, I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as two officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there! He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, but things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
Look, Mark.
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night.
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway, lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, "Maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually." Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified, and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. The eccentric person on the bus. The cold and quiet night in a small town. Bella often took the bus to get to her workplace. Every day, Bella waited at the same bus stop, quietly watching the world pass by while sipping her coffee. One evening, as usual, she waited for the bus to return home. But there was a man who caught her attention, sending a slight chill down her spine. A man in his 30s, disheveled hair, unshaven, boarded the bus after her. He sat a few rows behind her, but she could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. There was something strange about his presence. Every day on the bus, that man reappeared, always boarding right after her, and his strange behavior began. At first, he walked by and left behind a crude and eerie doll, saying, "This is for you," a gift, before quickly walking away. Bella found it odd and didn't pick it up, ignoring it and moving to another spot out of fear. Sometimes, he would mumble to himself in faint, incomprehensible whispers. Bella grew increasingly uncomfortable, but brushed it off, chalking it up to just an eccentric man. After all, he was just another bus passenger. As days passed without seeing him, she began to feel relieved, thinking she might have overreacted. One evening, Bella sat in her usual spot near the back of the bus. As the bus passed a stop, she saw a familiar figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. Then he boarded the bus. She avoided looking at him, pretending not to notice. She sighed in relief as he walked past, but her relief didn't last long as he doubled back and sat right next to her, despite plenty of empty seats around. She didn't dare move. He didn't look directly at Bella, but occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Then, suddenly, he turned his head toward her, locking eyes with her for a brief moment. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, sending chills down Bella's spine. At the next stop, he said nothing, simply placed a small piece of paper in her hand and got off the bus immediately, leaving her stunned. Throughout the ride, I didn't dare to open it. When I finally did, curiosity got the better of me. The note read, "I will follow you." Bella's heart raced as she hastily got off the bus. Bella hurriedly stepped off the bus and started walking faster, but then she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. As soon as she entered her room, she locked all the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, from the window, she saw his figure lurking at the edge of the road, watching her. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination driven by fear. The next day, Bella took a different route to work, avoiding buses entirely. But paranoia crept in. She began to feel like someone resembling the man from the bus was watching her from alleys, observing her from afar. Then the nightmare struck. A cold hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, she turned around in shock to see him, the man who had been following her from the bus. He gripped her tightly and said in a chilling voice, "You don't need to be scared. I just want to make sure you're safe." Bella was too terrified to think, only desperate to escape. She screamed, "Let me go," but it didn't change anything. His eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking. Luckily, Bella had prepared for the worst. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and sprayed it into his face, leaving him writhing in pain and temporarily blinded. Terrified, she ran without looking back and collapsed at a small roadside diner nearby, seeking help. He was apprehended shortly after being reported. He confessed that his obsession with Bella stemmed from her uncanny resemblance to his late girlfriend, who had died in a bus accident he couldn't prevent. He was diagnosed with PTSD, and seeing Bella on the bus had triggered his obsession. The man was later admitted to a facility for treatment. Bella, though still haunted by the events, found solace in knowing that the man wasn't truly a threat, but a broken soul lost in his past. But after all, everything had finally come to an end. The Uber driver's nightmare trip. The Uber nightmare, it was just another night on the job. Not that I enjoyed these late shifts, but my rent was due in a week, and I'd already spent all my money on new tires and an oil change. I'd been driving every night. I really hated driving at night. The fog, the isolation, it always gave me chills. I had just dropped off a drunk couple from a bar when my phone buzzed, signaling the next ride. As I drove to pick up my next passenger, I noticed it was the exact spot where I had picked up the couple just half an hour earlier. I figured it was just a strange coincidence. I stopped at the pickup location but didn't see anyone. The fog had thickened, as if swallowing the entire street. I honked the horn and glanced around to see if anyone was coming, but there was no one. I quickly checked my phone to confirm the pickup spot on the app. Just as I was about to double-check the app, my back door suddenly opened, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I let out a nervous laugh, even feeling a little embarrassed. It was a man. He didn't say a word as he got in and sat down, clutching a brown paper bag tightly. There was something unsettling about the way he held that bag. After a moment, he told me he knew the couple I had just dropped off. Then, he asked me to take him to the same location where I'd dropped them off earlier. I keyed in the address and started driving. A few miles down the road, my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped. I got a notification from Uber that someone else wanted to be picked up along the way. It was odd, considering it was past 3 in the morning. I arrived at the new pickup location, and she was standing beneath a streetlight, making her easy to spot. She ran toward the passenger seat, and instinctively, I unlocked the door for her to sit up front. With the man in the back seat, I didn't want to take any chances. I turned away and focused on driving. I glanced at her again. There was something about the way she looked at the man in the back seat, as if they shared a connection, but weren't saying it out loud. We drove in silence. I checked the map. All 3 of them were headed to the same address where I'd dropped off the couple earlier. My mind started racing. What's going on? Why is she going there too? Then I curiously asked, "So, do you all know each other?" She smiled, turned to me, and nodded. "Yes," she said with absolute confidence. When we arrived at the address, I noticed all the lights were off. They began walking toward the house, and before leaving, the woman turned back and said, "Just wait here for a minute. We'll be right back." Both disappeared into the darkness. I stared ahead and sat there for a few minutes, wondering for a moment, Should I just leave? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on my car window. She yelled, "Please, hurry, hurry. My friend needs help. We need your help to get her to the hospital." I tried to shake off the fear in my mind and got out of the car to follow her. When we reached the door, the man slammed it shut behind me. He shoved me to the ground, and I saw the knife in his hand. The woman's voice changed, her calm demeanor replaced by a cruel laugh. She slowly turned to me and told me to run while laughing maniacally. I crawled as quickly as I could to the dining room, and I couldn't believe my eyes, the couple I had dropped off an hour ago. But they were no longer alive. The man was now behind me. He was so close. I ran as fast as I could. Luckily, he slipped, giving me just enough time to sprint up the stairs. I wedged myself into a closet, trying to suppress my sobs. I wasn't sure how long I could stay hidden. Then I suddenly realized there was a figure, a woman, standing in front of the closet. Perhaps the blood trail on the floor had given me away. I hesitated, but saw she was alone outside. I took a chance, shoved the door open, and knocked her to the ground. I hurried to the window without hesitation. I smashed the glass, breaking it, and climbed out. Pain shot through my arm, but I ignored it. I couldn't go back. I just ran, got into my car, and drove straight to the police station. My efforts paid off. The next morning, investigators uncovered the full extent of the killer's crimes. Dozens of drivers had been lured to their deaths in the same way I had been. They had used ride-sharing services as a cover, abducting innocent victims one by one, all for their dark purposes. This ruthless duo had evaded capture many times, but not this time. They were arrested. I felt incredibly lucky because, as far as I knew, most people didn't survive. The nightmare, it seemed, had finally ended. The impersonator of the babysitter. Dylan was home alone, sitting on the couch in the living room, when his mom walked in with Joshua, a thin man who looked nervous. He was 12 years old and believed he was old enough to stay home alone, but his parents insisted on hiring a babysitter. Dylan immediately disliked Joshua, calling him a clumsy loser, a nerd in his head. Joshua tried to be friendly, but his anxiety was clear. His mom handed over the rules for the evening. Joshua had to make sure Dylan ate, didn't stay up too late, and didn't watch horror movies. But Dylan was determined to make everything difficult. He rolled his eyes and agreed reluctantly. Once they left, Dylan turned on a horror movie with gory scenes, deliberately trying to make Joshua uncomfortable. He enjoyed watching Joshua jump at every scare, his face growing paler with each moment. Dylan started suggesting Joshua order a pizza. He almost ran into the kitchen to get away from the TV screen, and Dylan couldn't stop laughing. While he was on the phone ordering, a new, wicked idea popped into Dylan's head. After a while, they got their pizza. But as Dylan observed, something was off in Joshua's behavior. He seemed too anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest noise. Dylan found this strange but shrugged it off, still focused on achieving his goal. Bored and wanting to scare the babysitter, Dylan suggested they play hide and seek in the dark. He thought Joshua would be desperate to escape the horror movie and agreed without hesitation. Things started to get strange. While in the bathroom, Dylan heard the doorbell ring, but he was a little surprised since the pizza was delivered so early. But when he stepped out, he saw Joshua staring at the front door with a scared expression, saying no one was there, and he thought it was the pizza delivery guy. The game started, and Joshua went to hide. Dylan found him after 5 minutes. Dylan asked,
"Why didn't you try hiding in the basement?"
Joshua said,
"The dark scares me."
In Dylan's mind, the perfect plan continued to form. Joshua began pressing his face into the wall and counting while Dylan hid, thoroughly enjoying his plan. The boy hid in the kitchen, secretly holding the TV remote, waiting for the perfect moment. As he started searching and approached the TV, the boy suddenly turned the volume all the way up, the sound of a terrifying scene, nearly giving him a heart attack. That was when the boy thought about hiding in his parents' closet to jump out and scare him. Dylan quietly tiptoed towards the bedroom, opened the closet, and that's when everything went still. Inside the closet was a dead body. It was a man with his head wrapped in a plastic bag, seemingly suffocated. Dylan, in a panic, tried to understand the situation, and suddenly I noticed a wallet sticking out of the man's pocket. The boy reached for it. He found an ID card that read Joshua Miller. If his babysitter, Joshua Miller, was dead in the closet, then the boy had no idea who he was playing hide and seek with. There was a killer in his house. He quickly ran under the bed, trying to steady his breath so the man wouldn't hear him breathing. A pair of feet entered and stopped right in front of the open closet.
Congratulations. It seems like you found your babysitter,
he said. Dylan realized that the game he had set up just minutes ago had now turned into a survival mission, as his life depended on it. The man pretending to be Joshua revealed himself to be Kyle. He had planned to trap Joshua for killing the boy, and now he intended to kill Dylan as well. His face suddenly dipped under the bed, and he screamed,
"It's your turn to be like Joshua."
Dylan, in a final desperate moment, ran out from under the bed. Kyle chased him, lunging at him with a knife. The blade ripped his shirt, but luckily it missed.
"I thought you liked horror movies."
He mocked the boy.
"This is your real-life horror movie, kid."
Dylan fearfully ran into a room and locked the door. Then he heard the doorbell. Through the window, he saw it was the pizza delivery person. Dylan shouted for help.
Call 911 right now.
But before the pizza guy could assess the situation, Joshua ran downstairs, opened the door, and charged at him with a knife. The pizza guy was stronger. After a struggle, he managed to pin Kyle down and snatched the knife from his hand. Kyle was convicted of murder. Dylan's parents rushed home after being contacted by the police. They were also grateful and gave the pizza guy a sum of money to thank him for saving the boy. Dylan's parents never left him alone with anyone again. Whenever they had to go out, he stayed with his grandmother. They would never hire a babysitter again. The horror Dylan experienced that night would stay with him forever. Home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs, calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry, trying to steady her trembling hands. She dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, she fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. The Nightmare Delivery Trip. Ryan, a hard-working pizza delivery driver, had been working night shifts for 2 years. His job usually involved driving, delivering, and collecting payments. Most nights went smoothly, but one fateful night changed everything. Near midnight, Ryan received the final delivery order of his shift. The address was on the outskirts of town, near the industrial area, a place he had never delivered to before. The streets were eerily deserted, with most streetlights flickering or completely off. The place always gave him a sense of isolation, but Ryan assumed it was just another late-night delivery. He saw a small, rundown house that didn't scream danger. Yet, something felt off about the place. At the end of the driveway stood a tall man wearing a gray coat and jeans. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Ryan's car with an unsettling smile. Ryan hesitated but regained his composure, grabbed the pizza, and approached the man.
Hey, here's your pizza,
Ryan said, naming the price, but the man didn't rush to pay. Instead, the man slowly pulled out a handful of coins. He began counting them one by one, placing each coin into his other hand, as if performing some ritual. The air grew colder with each passing second. My fingers began to freeze around the pizza box. The man's grin widened as he said,
"You drive too fast, Ryan."
Ryan froze. How did he know his name? Panic surged through him.
What?
Ryan stammered.
I don't know you. I don't think we've met before.
Then Ryan quickly backed away. He hurried back to his car, started the engine, and drove off. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the man still standing there, holding the pizza and staring at him. But that wasn't the last time. A week later, near the end of his shift, Ryan's manager assigned him one final pizza delivery for the night, another strange order. The address was a house on the outskirts of town, near where he had gone before. The house he arrived at looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and peeling paint. A note was taped to the door, delivered to the basement. A chill ran down Ryan's spine. Delivering to a basement was unusual. Reluctantly, needing to finish the job, he decided to follow the instructions. As he approached the basement door, he hesitated. A loud creak sounded as he opened it, revealing a narrow, chilly staircase leading down. Something felt off.
Hello?
Ryan called, his voice trembling, but there was no response. At the bottom, the basement stretched into darkness, with several doors lining the walls. One door was slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out. The small room was dimly lit by a single lamp. In the center of the room was a figure of a man, entirely sculpted out of wax. It was almost perfectly life-sized, like a real person. At first, Ryan thought it was some kind of artwork. The figure slumped in a chair, its wax face eerie and lifelike, with deep eyes and a twisted, unsettling smile. The extraordinary detail made him shiver, wrinkles on the skin, hairs embedded perfectly in the wax. But there was something unsettling, a thin layer of moisture on the wax, making it seem as though it was sweating. Ryan placed the pizza box on the table, instinct urging him to leave. But something about the figure drew him closer. As he got closer, he noticed small cracks running along the wax skin. And then he saw it. Beneath one of the cracks was something red, a dark, congealed liquid. He didn't want to think it, but it might have been blood. Then, as he put his hand near the nose, he felt a faint breath. He leaned closer, and that's when he noticed the chest. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the chest was rising and falling ever so slightly. Ryan turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. Ryan spun around to see a man stepping out from the corner of the room, tall, gaunt. It was him, the man Ryan had met earlier. He wore a dark apron, stained with streaks of wax and blood. In his hand, he held a brush dripping with molten wax. Ryan held his breath as he realized what the man intended. Just as he thought, the figure in the chair wasn't a sculpture but a person, encased in wax, still alive. The man stepped closer, holding the brush like a weapon.
"You shouldn't have come here, but maybe you'll make a fine addition."
Ryan dashed for the door, but the man was quicker, grabbing his arm. His grip was cold and sticky, and Ryan could feel the wax coating his skin.
Help me.
Ryan turned to see the wax man's lips moving, his eyes darting desperately. It was the first sign of life he had shown. Ryan broke free from the man's grip, grabbed the desk lamp, and smashed it into the man's face. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Ryan scrambled for the door, fumbling for the handle. Behind him, the man screamed in pain, and the buzzing in the air turned into a high-pitched shriek. Ryan bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. When he finally made it home, he scrubbed at his skin, desperate to remove the faint traces of wax clinging to his arms. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he couldn't shake the feeling it was still there. Ryan quit his job the next day and reported the incident to the police. He tried to forget what he had seen, but every night he was haunted by the image of the wax man's eyes. Behind the neighbor's door. It was December, and the neighborhood had started decorating for the holidays. I knew all my neighbors, and they were all very friendly. The neighbors lit up the streets with their festive displays. Paul, our neighbor to the right, was no different. He had put up his lights early, which I found unusual for a single man in his 40s. He seemed kind enough, though a bit lonely. I didn't see him often. He came and went for work, but I always greeted him when we crossed paths. Recently, though, I hadn't seen him at all. His car hadn't moved from the driveway in days. One night, I noticed Paul's house across the street. His Christmas lights were flickering wildly, not the usual twinkling effect. It was erratic, more like a wiring glitch. The flickering lights gave the house an unsettling feeling. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just some electrical issue, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I went to work. Paul's car was still in the driveway, and once again, all his curtains were tightly shut. That evening, I went outside and saw everything was exactly the same as the night before. I decided to be kind and let him know, as well as check if he was okay since I hadn't seen him. I walked over, hesitating for a moment before knocking on the door. There was no answer, so I rang the bell. Again, nothing. After the third ring, Paul finally opened the door. Paul greeted me with a forced smile. I told him about his flickering Christmas lights and how I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I asked if he was okay, since I hadn't seen him in a while. He said he just wasn't feeling well. From the way he spoke, I felt his demeanor was awkward and cold. I noticed when he raised his hand, there were black smudges or soot on it. I glanced down briefly, and he immediately pulled his hand back behind him. Then I heard something from inside the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it sounded like a child's voice. Paul didn't have any kids. I was about to ask if he heard it too, but I decided against it. It sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Paul, but he didn't seem to notice. The sound seemed to come from deep within his house, distant and muffled. His expression didn't change, but there was a coldness in his eyes. I was about to leave, but something inside me, an indescribable feeling, held me back. Then I decided to go back. He was about to close the door when he seemed surprised to see me return. I awkwardly made an excuse, asking if I could borrow some tools to fix a pipe. He politely and courteously invited me into the house. While Paul was rummaging through things in the living room, I asked if I could use the bathroom. On the way, I noticed something strange, a bookshelf in an almost empty room. It was placed in an oddly conspicuous spot and had a few stacks of cardboard boxes. As I got closer, I noticed dark stains on the walls and smudges on the bookshelf. They looked strange. Drawn by the oddity, I tried to take a closer look.
Is it making a knocking sound?
I thought I heard something and slowly moved closer to investigate. It sounded almost like something or someone was moving behind the bookshelf. Just as I reached out to touch it, Paul suddenly appeared in the doorway, asking,
"What are you doing?"
I quickly lied, saying I was just admiring some of the books. Glancing at the bookshelf, I smiled and asked,
"Do you enjoy detective and mystery stories too? Let's talk about them."
But he gave a forced smile and nodded.
"Sure. Now can you leave?"
Seeing this, I decided to leave. After leaving, my mind was filled with questions. Why was Paul acting so strange? Why did that room feel so unsettling? It left me with a genuinely weird and uneasy feeling. I decided I would keep a closer eye on him for my own safety. A few days later, I kept observing and devised a plan. I stood in front of Paul's house with some pastries in hand, ready to knock and invite him to a Christmas gathering. As usual, Paul politely declined the invitation, but mentioned he might stop by later. A few minutes later, I saw Paul leave his house, get into his car, and drive off to somewhere suspicious. Seizing the opportunity, I cautiously made my way to the back of his house. He might return quickly, since the back door wasn't locked. I hesitated for a moment, considering leaving, unsure if this was the right thing to do. But then my eyes caught something that made me realize I couldn't hesitate any longer. I saw it, the trash can outside Paul's house. Items that didn't belong, rags stained with dark streaks and dried specks that looked like blood, and even children's clothing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The door creaked open, and I slipped inside. The house was silent, eerily still. I cautiously moved toward the bookshelf I had seen and suspected earlier. As I approached the shelf, I fumbled around and noticed a book sticking out oddly. I grabbed it and pulled it out. As I pulled it, the bookshelf suddenly shifted, revealing a dark space that looked like a hidden room. I stepped inside and was utterly horrified. The room was a chaotic mess, boxes, shattered items, and strange objects scattered everywhere. In the far corner, something moved in the shadows. I took another step forward, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. Then, there he was, a little boy, trembling and trapped in the basement, his wide eyes filled with fear. My first instinct was to help the boy. I barely managed to remove the gag from his mouth when footsteps echoed through the house. Paul was back. My worst fear had come true. I quickly crouched down and whispered urgently to the boy, telling him to stay quiet as I guided him to hide. I hurriedly ran to find a different hiding spot, but Paul already suspected someone was in the house and began searching. He discovered me when I carelessly let part of my shirt show. He stomped on my shirt and said,
"You shouldn't have come here."
Before I could react, Paul grabbed a nearby baseball bat and began swinging it forcefully at me. I barely dodged the first blow. Objects shattered around me. I rushed toward the kitchen, hoping to distract him and keep him away from the boy. My hand grabbed a pepper shaker, and I threw it into Paul's face to obscure his vision. But it didn't faze him at all. Taking advantage of his momentary blindness, I grabbed a frying pan and struck him on the head, forcing him to stagger back. The blows he landed on me left painful bruises, and his strength was greater than I had anticipated. I kept running to distract him, but I realized too late that he had gone down to the basement to find the boy. I called the police and ran down, throwing objects to distract him. I shouted at him to surrender, warning him that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Paul pretended to surrender or negotiate, but he immediately launched a surprise attack when I let my guard down. Once again, I found myself at a disadvantage. He grabbed my neck and began choking me as I desperately reached for a glass bottle nearby, but I couldn't grasp it. I was nearly losing consciousness from the strangulation when, unexpectedly, the boy screamed, distracting Paul and giving me an opening. I seized the moment, grabbed the bottle, and struck him on the head. With a painful groan, Paul staggered back and finally released his grip on my neck. I quickly got up, pulled the boy up the basement stairs, and locked every door behind me. The police arrived within minutes, surrounding Paul's house. Paul was arrested, but what they uncovered left me horrified. The boy had been abducted from a completely different town and had been held in the basement for over 4 days. As for the flickering Christmas lights, the boy was a genius who had somehow figured out how to manipulate them from the basement as a cry for help to attract someone's attention outside. The nightmare was finally over. I was relieved that the boy was reunited with his family. I hoped he would go on to live a normal life and overcome this ordeal. The eccentric neighbor upstairs. I grew up in a small suburban area, living in a quiet apartment on the second floor, right next to the stairs leading up to the third floor. There was one thing that always bothered me: the man who lived upstairs, almost as if he was the only one there. Mr. Huns was a middle-aged man who never spoke to anyone in the building. The kids in the building avoided him. Every morning, Mr. Huns would walk down to the sidewalk in front of his apartment and, with an odd, meticulous habit, water the grass. Only the grass. No flowers, no bushes, just small patches of grass by the sidewalk. His movements were strange, almost robotic. No one ever spoke to him. He was the kind of person everyone avoided. One night, Charlie came over for a sleepover. We watched a basketball game that evening and then went to bed. But Charlie couldn't let it go. He became obsessed with learning more about Mr. Huns.
Does he have a wife? A family?
Charlie sat up, his curiosity reigniting. His face lit up with a mischievous grin, and before I knew it, he was heading for the door. I hated this, but out of concern, I reluctantly followed him. We snuck out of our apartment and headed up to the third floor. I stayed back to lock the door before leaving. Charlie was already going up the stairs. I caught a glimpse of him.
Charlie, please stop, don't.
When I reached the top, I saw Charlie standing outside Mr. Huns' apartment, his right hand on the doorbell.
Charlie, what the heck? Stop it!
Without warning, Charlie turned to me and said,
Get ready to run. All right, run!
We bolted down the stairs like our lives depended on it.
Who's there?
I heard Mr. Huns stepping out of his apartment. Then the door slammed shut behind us, and we could hear his footsteps coming closer and closer. We gasped for breath, panicking as we ran down the hallway. Reaching my door, Charlie began to freak out, and I broke into a sweat when I realized I didn't have the keys. Charlie yanked me into a dimly lit storage room at the end of the hall. We crouched behind a pile of boxes, trying to make ourselves as small as possible so he wouldn't see us. Minutes passed as we carefully listened to the diminishing sound of footsteps, fading into near silence. We thought he had left and sighed in relief. Just as we turned the corner in the hallway, a few seconds later, I felt something was off. Suddenly, I was grabbed by the collar from behind. Charlie was walking ahead of me, so who was behind me? I slowly turned my head to look, and it was him. He had a firm grip on my shirt, and my feet were no longer touching the ground. Then, he lifted me into the air. Charlie froze, his mind spinning. Too scared, he ran away and left me there. I felt like I was being suffocated by his strength. The man leaned in close to my face and said,
Hey kid, you messed with the wrong person.
In my despair, as my vision began to blur, I saw Charlie coming back. He moved silently, like a shadow, sneaking up behind the man. He was signaling to me. I understood and started struggling against the man to distract him. Taking advantage of the man's distraction, Charlie kicked the back of his knee, causing him to stumble and lose balance, making me fall to the ground as well. Seizing the opportunity, we escaped right then and there. Once we were outside the apartment, everything would be over. Reaching the first floor, Charlie ran to the emergency exit and banged on it, but it seemed to be locked. Realizing that we might not escape, just then, the door opened from the outside. A woman was there, asking what we were doing. I heard his footsteps growing fainter. Perhaps we had escaped. When we got back home, Charlie and I were punished. Later, he showed me a newspaper article featuring Mr. Huns. He was a former patient, someone abnormal ever since his wife had gone missing and could not be found. Despite many efforts, they couldn't find his wife. When they searched his house, instead of food in his pantry, they found jars filled with dead bugs. Many speculated that they were his food, but I think this is enough. We won't dig any deeper. In the end, perhaps we should be more cautious with our jokes and thoughts to avoid bad consequences. Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one, but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks, and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner, and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m., when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
"Did you forget something? Don't joke like that."
But no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining.
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby, ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. The dark truck. Jack Carson, a rough-mannered, long-haul truck driver known for taking jobs no one else wanted, embarked on a long journey down an infamous, desolate road. His truck was tightly sealed, labeled only as medical supplies. The highway stretched endlessly, eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of dead trees in the wind. It was the kind of road you only took if you absolutely had to. Jack stopped at a solitary, dilapidated rest area. He stepped out for a smoke, the silence pressing on him like a physical weight. The wind carried faint, eerie whispers. Jack couldn't tell where they came from, but as he looked around, there was no one in sight. As he leaned against the truck, breathing in the air, a soft yet menacing voice whispered in his ear.
You will die, as I did.
Startled, he turned around, dropping his cigarette, but there was no one there. Just a strange mist swirling outside the window. Shaken, Jack climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut. He had never experienced anything that felt so real. As soon as he started the engine, the radio turned on with an old, haunting tune. He brushed it off, thinking it was a malfunction. His hands trembled as he turned the knob to silence it, but the static continued, almost as if mocking him. Driving down the dark stretch of road, those words kept echoing in his mind.
You will die, as I did.
Growing louder with each passing moment. Driving deeper into the night, Jack noticed movement on the roadside. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing, thinking it might be an animal. But as he got closer, the shapes formed into human figures, standing on the roadside, half hidden in the mist. Some waved cheerfully, but upon closer inspection, their smiles were twisted and maniacal, exuding malicious hatred. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes devoid of life. One figure pressed itself against the windshield, grinning mischievously. Jack held his breath as he slammed on the brakes. The figure vanished as soon as he looked away, leaving only the sound of the truck's tires screeching against the pavement. He gasped for breath, panic rising. What the hell is going on? Jack's eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist. The highway seemed endless. Jack could feel fatigue setting in. His eyelids grew heavy, and the road stretched on endlessly. He eventually stopped at another rest area, hoping to catch some sleep. Jack leaned back in the cabin, closing his eyes and falling into a deep sleep, the hum of the engine lulling him into a false sense of security. Then Jack woke up with a start. A weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands were pinned to the seat, leaving him unable to move. A wailing scream tore through the air, very close, as if it came from right in front of Jack. His eyes shot open wide. A figure, a woman, stood before him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes milky white and hollow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if the world was closing in on him. And then everything went dark. He jolted awake, gasping for air. The sun was rising as Jack stepped out of the truck, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to take him. The mist had cleared, but the memory of the woman's wailing cry lingered in Jack's mind. Jack returned to the desolate road he had driven 1,000 times before. Tempted by money, he ignored what he had seen before. The thick fog swallowed everything. A figure, barely visible in the mist, darted in front of the truck. Jack swerved, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered, narrowly missing the faint figure as it lunged toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the truck wobbled back under control, Jack glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing, no figure, no movement. Shaking, he took a sip of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to calm him. It wasn't long before Jack's anxiety turned to sheer terror. Suddenly, an icy chill swept through the cabin, making the hair on his neck stand up. He felt someone sitting beside him. He glanced at the passenger seat. A pale woman with sunken eyes and disheveled black hair, dressed in tattered clothes, sat there in eerie silence. She slowly turned her head to face him, staring intently.
Now it's your turn to pay for the lives you've taken.
Jack gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control of the truck, demanding to know who she was. Then the woman lunged at him, her icy hands tightening around his neck. Jack screamed, but it was choked off. Disoriented, Jack instinctively hit the gas as he struggled to break free from the crushing grip. The truck swerved, its tires screeching on the wet road. Jack's vision blurred, his mind spinning as if he were sinking into darkness. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other flailing in the air. His fingers passed through her futilely. "Please don't do this." The woman didn't respond, her gaze glowing with a deadly hatred. Jack felt the truck slipping out of control, sliding sideways toward the edge of the road. He tried to hit the brakes, but his legs were numb. Jack's world went black. His body slumped into the seat. The truck careened off the road, the sound of metal scraping against gravel and dirt filling the air until it crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the ravine. The next morning, police investigators arrived at the crash site. The mangled truck lay at the bottom of the ravine, its cargo spilled across the ground. They found Jack's body in the driver's seat, his neck twisted to one side, bruised heavily as if something had crushed it. Investigators and forensic teams began examining the wreckage. Beneath the layers of cargo, they uncovered sealed containers marked with warning labels. Then they uncovered a horrifying truth. Hidden among the legitimate goods were human organs. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He was a trafficker of human organs, disguised as a legitimate cargo hauler. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed an illicit network that Jack was a part of, operating under protection for years. Many innocent lives had been lost at the hands of these merciless criminals. The ghost of the woman stood at a distance, her purpose fulfilled. For Jack, it was too late. He had no chance to turn back. He had faced the consequences of his actions. The ghost train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. but I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. "They left me." I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, What do we do now? I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. He's coming. We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, the man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. The threat of the gas station customer. Evie had been working the night shift at the gas station for many years. It was always quiet, slow, and uneventful. Her shifts usually started at 8 p.m. every day. The first few hours passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers coming in for gas or snacks. But after 11 p.m., the traffic slowed, and by midnight, the station became eerily quiet. She tried to keep herself busy, organizing merchandise on the shelves and cleaning, but there wasn't much to do. The silence and the ticking of the clock made the second half of her shift feel endless. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into one of the parking spots near the entrance. At first, She didn't think much of it. Most cars came in for gas and left immediately. But this car just sat there. No one got out. She stood up straight behind the counter, waiting for anyone inside to come in. She leaned over the counter, looking through the glass door, but nothing happened. Maybe they were just resting? She shrugged and continued scrolling on her phone, distracted for about 20 minutes. When she looked up from her phone, there, standing in one of the aisles, was a man. He was just there, staring at her. She hadn't heard the doorbell, hadn't seen him walk in. How had he gotten inside without her noticing? The man quickly averted his gaze when he saw her looking. He appeared to be in his 40s floor, wearing a dark coat and a scruffy beanie. There was something about him that made her uneasy. He moved slowly through the aisles, his eyes occasionally glancing toward her, as if assessing whether she was watching him. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. She tried to remain calm, watching him closely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something bad. Suddenly, he turned toward the front door and hurried outside. She dashed out the door, her heart racing. The car was still parked there, but the man walked right past it, disappearing into the darkness along the road. She went straight to the security camera to figure out how he had gotten in without her noticing. She pulled up the footage, scanning through until she found the moment he arrived. The footage showed him stepping out of the parked car, but instead of going inside immediately, he stealthily made his way around to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras there, but she knew those doors were never locked because they were broken. What chilled her the most was the timing. 15 minutes passed between the moment he went behind the building and when he appeared in the store. 15 minutes he spent lurking out of sight, waiting for something. Weeks had passed since that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shift felt like a test for her. One night, while she was cleaning the counters, she noticed something strange. The man entered the store, his eyes scanning as if searching for something. She watched him from the corner of her eye, and that was when she saw it. Something that seemed horrific. Then he approached her checkout, and she thought she might have guessed right. Dark stains on his sleeve, splotches that looked like blood clinging to the fabric, and he had done something vile and horrible. She wasn't sure if it was the same man, but she sensed it was him by his stature and clothing. She froze, her hands clenched, as he slowly moved down the aisle, seemingly oblivious to her stare. He quickly slipped away, melting into the shadows, and she was left in silence. She resolved to take action. The next time he appeared, she would be ready. A few nights later, he returned. She heard the faint sound of the doorbell and looked up to see him standing right inside, his face hidden in the shadows. She quietly picked up the phone, dialed the police, and kept her voice just above a whisper. She reported the suspicious man, describing his erratic behavior and the blood she had seen on his sleeve. But then, he noticed her. His eyes narrowed, and he realized what she was doing. Without warning, he charged toward her, knocking the phone from her hand. She stumbled back, grabbing anything she could use to defend herself as he backed her into a corner, his face contorted into a disturbing grin. She collided with the shelves, knocking items to the floor. She tried to grab a can from a nearby rack and threw it at him, buying herself a split second to dodge him and run toward the door. But he was quick, grabbing her arm and pulling her back, forcing her against the back of the store. I encouraged myself to survive and reassured myself that the police would arrive soon. He tightened his grip and pressed his face close to hers with a terrifying gaze. She felt panic rising, but she saw the police through the glass. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and glanced at her, then looked at the man's hand on her arm. It was a signal, a silent cue. She knew what she had to do. Gathering all her courage, she turned slightly, catching the man off guard, and bit his hand. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to escape. She stumbled forward, getting out of his reach. The police burst through the door, quickly advancing with their weapons drawn. He hesitated, his face contorted with anger, but he knew he was outnumbered. The officers moved in, bringing him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. He thrashed, his eyes filled with rage as they restrained him. One of the officers approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They said he was a dangerous man, wanted for multiple assaults and murders in the city. She blinked, the reality of his words sinking in. A murderer? The thought sent chills down her spine, and she felt the weight of the encounter heavier than ever. She nodded, grateful that he had finally been apprehended. The man hadn't just been lurking around the police station. He had been hiding, waiting, blending into the shadows, ready to strike. The police finished their reports, and she was left alone in the quiet gas station. The shelves were disarrayed, items scattered after their struggle. The man was gone, but she couldn't shake off the horror of it all. The scars he left would remain with her, a reminder of the darkness lurking just beyond the light. Mysterious treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and noticed the mess tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody.
There's nothing here. We should leave.
But Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
"We need to go. Now."
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
"My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute."
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. Oh, with a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Andra." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. "We need to get to the car." We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again, the sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nicky spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nicky stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. Strangers on the 6th floor. It was late, and the apartment building loomed tall against the misty sky, the dim lights flickering in the fog. The street was quiet, deserted except for the occasional sound of cars in the distance. I wanted to take a walk to get some fresh air. As I walked toward the elevator, the air suddenly turned cold, sending a shiver down my spine. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator started descending. Suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The doors slid open with a small creak, and there stood a woman. She was thin, with hollow cheeks, and her messy hair hung over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. I felt uneasy as I noticed she was barefoot, her dirty feet resting on the cold elevator floor. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if she were in pain. Her head remained down, and her movements were slow and deliberate. I moved to the other side of the elevator, holding my breath as she took her place. Something about her appearance left me feeling unsettled. Her dirty dress, her gaunt face, she looked like a homeless person. Her gaze stayed fixed on the elevator floor, scanning as if searching for something invisible, even though there was nothing there. She never looked up, her hands trembling. I began to feel afraid just looking at her. When the elevator reached the 1st floor, I rushed out, not daring to look back. I quickly exited the building, trying to shake off the encounter, but questions lingered in my mind. Who was that woman? She didn't seem like she belonged here. A little while later, I returned to the building. I pressed the elevator button, eager to get back to my apartment. When the doors opened, my heart skipped a beat. She was there again. This time, she was crawling on the ground, her face pressed against the floor. Her hands frantically moved across the cold floor, still searching for something. The sight was so strange, so terrifying, that I hesitated at the entrance. For a moment, I considered taking the stairs, but something urged me to step inside. My heart raced as I pressed the button for the 9th floor. The elevator began to rise, but it stopped again at the 6th floor. The doors opened, and she crawled out, her body moving slowly along the hallway floor. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my mind spinning. What was she looking for? All night, I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. She must have been a homeless person who had lost her mind and broken into the building. I tried to convince myself that was the only explanation. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. A few days later, I woke up early for a morning run. It was still quite early, so the building and hallways were quiet. As I approached the elevator, I pressed the button, feeling a bit anxious, as I remembered the woman from the other night. The elevator descended and stopped once again at the 6th floor. The doors slid open. This time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. His hair was messy, his clothes filthy. He hunched over, one hand clutching his stomach. His face was pale, his eyes vacant. He stepped into the elevator, moving slowly, as if in pain. My heart started to race. The similarities were too striking to ignore. I whispered, "Are you okay? What are you looking for?" The man turned to look at me, his eyes staring into mine. They were hollow, lifeless, his face contorted in pain. His voice was hoarse as he mumbled, "I've lost something. My stomach hurts." Before I could respond, he collapsed onto the floor, lying face down just like the woman. He started crawling, dragging his hands across the floor, searching for something invisible. Everything about it was eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I had no idea what was waiting for me next or how I would face it. The morning sunlight shone through the dusty window as I entered the apartment management office, my nerves still on edge from the strange events of the past few days. I needed answers, anything to explain the bizarre encounters in the elevator. I entered the management office and told him about the strange things I had seen. I mentioned seeing some strange people using the elevator from the 6th floor. They looked like a homeless couple, barefoot and dirty. They always held their stomachs, as if they were in pain. The man frowned and pulled out a list of tenants. He glanced over it and then looked back at me, shaking his head. He said no such couple existed. No one matching my description lived on the 6th floor. I stood there, stunned. If no one lived there, then who were the people I had seen? Still uneasy, I headed to the mailroom, hoping that doing something simple like picking up my mail would calm my nerves. When I opened the mailbox, something caught my eye. It was the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 rooms were listed, 601 and 602, along with a water bill. One strange thing I noticed was that the water bill for room 602 was unusually high. I blinked, staring at the numbers. It didn't make sense. How could someone use that much water? Something was really off. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after a late night at work. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening on the 6th floor. As the elevator doors slid open, I froze. Inside the elevator stood a large man, holding a long, heavy golf bag. There was a strange odor, a faint metallic smell wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The button for the 6th floor was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag down the dark hallway toward room 602. I waited until he disappeared before stepping out of the elevator, my heart pounding. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark on the floor that looked like blood. I had no idea what he was carrying in that bag. Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. My mind raced, piecing together the strange encounters. The barefoot couple, the blood, the water bill. Something horrific was happening in room 602. After pacing for what felt like hours, I finally picked up the phone and called the police. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the street outside my building. I watched from the window as the officers entered, heading straight to the 6th floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, wondering what they would find. Minutes passed, and I could only pace back and forth in my apartment, too anxious to sit down. Finally, I saw the police return. Their faces were grim, and one of them motioned for me to come down. I rushed down the stairs to meet them. I asked what they had found. They told me that inside room 602, they found a makeshift surgery room. There was blood everywhere. They also found a freezer and suspicious golf bags. Inside them were dismembered bodies. Their organs had been removed. I felt nauseous. Organ trafficking, right in my building. I could hardly comprehend it. I also asked them about the barefoot couple I had seen in the elevator, and they said there was no one else there that matched my description. Determined to understand what had happened, I asked to see the elevator security footage. As the video played, my heart raced. I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone, talking to no one. I felt numb. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The autopsy had been completed. The victims found in room 602 were all homeless. The people I saw in the elevator were likely the spirits of the 6th floor. They had been tragically taken by criminals and were still searching for something, perhaps a part of themselves. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, My aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying, tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper, "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 o'clock p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet. But that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine. But then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking, and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. The cursed game. The Willis family's house, her neighbors, stood quietly at the end of a dimly lit street. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Lily, who had done many jobs before, was starting her first day babysitting this time. The cozy living room was scattered with toys. Lily was greeted by Angie, a curious little girl. After listening to the parents' instructions and seeing them leave, the house was left to the two of them, growing silent. Angie leaned forward, her eyes lighting up mischievously.
Let's play a game. Call Mary.
Lily froze, letting out a nervous giggle. Angie tugged on Lily's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading.
Please, Lily. Just this once? I won't ask for anything else.
Lily hesitated, but Angie's persistence made her relent. Angie explained to Lily that they had to go into the bathroom, turn off all the lights, and say her name 3 times in front of the mirror. If they did, Mary would appear. They must not let the candle go out. Lily didn't really believe it, and thought it was just a made-up game. The bathroom was dimly lit by flickering candles. Lily stood in front of the mirror. She took a deep breath and said,
"All right, just this once."
And they'd go to bed. She called the woman's name. Before she could finish, Angie gasped and backed away, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Lily reassured her, saying it was fine, just a game, and it would end now. Then they'd go back to the room, just as they were about to leave. But then the candles suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. An icy chill swept over them. Lily led Angie out of the bathroom, but the house lights flickered erratically. From the bathroom, a soft whisper echoed throughout the house. Lily froze. Angie began to tear up and asked her,
What's that sound?
Before Lily could react, a figure, a woman, emerged from the bathroom, her hollow black eyes and mouth oozing a horrifying black sludge. Clutching Angie's hand, she began to step back. Together, they ran and hid in the dining room. Lily tried to turn on the lights, but they didn't work. It was as if they were trapped in another world. Lily pulled Angie under the dining table to hide from the ghost's pursuit. Through the gap beneath the tablecloth, Angie saw her bare feet shuffling closer. The floor creaked with each step. Lily ran to the bathroom. She quickly grabbed the matchbox from her pocket and lit the candles. Her hands trembled as she tried, but the flame refused to catch. It was too late. Behind Lily, she appeared, her distorted smile widening as she raised a pair of scissors. Lily panicked, dropping the matchbox and crawling backward, sobbing as she begged for mercy in vain. When Lily locked eyes with her, she felt pain engulf her entire body. She could do nothing but stare, the feeling worse than death. As the scissors slowly moved toward Lily's body, ready to tear through her skin and claim her life, Lily thought it was over. Then she heard the cry of a child. Suddenly, the lights came back on. Angie stood holding a candle and screamed.
Leave her alone.
Seeing this, Lily chanted her name 3 times to end the game. The candles suddenly flared to life. A piercing scream shook the house as she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Angie clung tightly to her.
She's gone, right?
Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark bathroom door. The Willis parents returned to find Angie asleep, with every light in the house on. Lily managed a tired smile. That day was Lily's first and last day as a babysitter. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing compared to what happened that night. Even if you don't believe, don't take the risk.